It's officially 2026, which means it's time to rank all the games I beat in 2025. I played through 16 games last year, and in this video, I'm gonna rank them all from worst to best. But before we get started, let's get some general notes out of the way. Number 1. This list includes every game I beat in 2025 across all release years, so not just specifically games that were released in 2025. Number 2. This list only includes games that I rolled credits on, and for games that don't have an ending in the traditional sense, I only included them if I felt I had played enough of them to have a judgment on them. Number 3. This video will not contain any major spoilers for any games I discuss here. I will try to keep all the footage shown on screen to early game content for each respective game I cover. However, discretion is advised, since of course I will have to discuss certain elements of each of these games. So if you see a game on this list that you want to play but also want to remain completely blind on, then feel free to skip past it. Anyways, with all that being said, let's get started with the ranking. Well, I am pretty disappointed to put this one at the bottom of the list. The original Little Nightmares, including its extra DLC campaign, was a very charming game. While it was nothing crazy, it utilized world building excellently to create a very eerie, atmospheric world and simple yet effective story. The first Little Nightmares set the foundation for its incredible sequel, a game that expanded upon the original in every single way. Little Nightmares 2 told a truly captivating story, had beautiful visuals, and had some really clever puzzles and monsters. It was overall a perfect sequel in every way, and it ended up becoming one of my favorite horror games ever made. So when Little Nightmares 3 was announced, I was of course very intrigued. Unfortunately, what we got was a soulless rehash of the first two games. I think now is a good point to mention that none of the games I played in 2025 were truly bad. This isn't a bad game, just a very mediocre one. And when I say mediocre, I truly mean it, because this game is as painfully average as it gets. It does nothing bad, but really nothing great either. Little Nightmares 3 has almost no identity of its own, with it essentially just borrowing different elements from the previous games, but doing them worse. The monsters are very derivative of the monsters from the previous games, and they overall feel more scripted and predictable. There's barely any new mechanics in this entire game, and the only new ones are insanely underutilized. There are actually some mechanics that only get used once or twice after they are introduced, and then never again throughout the whole game. The puzzles in this game are also brain-dead simple. Most puzzles in this game involve stuff as simple as throwing an item at a switch on the wall to open a door. And you do stuff like that so many times. Seriously, this game never had a single puzzle that actually challenged me at all. Well, okay, except for the times when the companion AI glitched and wouldn't cooperate with me on puzzles, and I ended up spending 10 minutes on a single puzzle thinking that I was doing something wrong, only to find out that I actually was doing the correct solution, but the companion AI was broken. And the only way to fix this issue was by reloading my save file. I had this happen to me multiple times throughout the game. Narratively, this game is fine. I do quite like the two protagonists, Lo and Alone, but in terms of the actual story, there is really not much interesting going on here at all. It really felt like a lot of the story beats in this game were almost directly ripped from the first game. And it is likely that the game will expand on the story with the upcoming DLC, but honestly, considering that this game costs $40 for 6 hours of mediocre gameplay, yeah, I don't think locking the actually interesting stuff behind DLC is the right move here. Honestly, I probably won't even buy the DLC unless I have literally nothing else to play and it goes for a good price. Because truth be told, there was really nothing in this entire game that actually intrigues me about what the DLC is going to be like. Visually, this game is also just the least appealing of the three. The lighting feels very cheaply done in comparison to how brilliant the ambient lighting looked in the first two games. I mean, it's certainly not bad, and I do actually think that there are some pretty cool shots in this game, but it's definitely not as stunning as the other ones. Ultimately, I think Little Nightmares 3 tried to play it safe, because this game was actually developed by a completely different studio than the other two games. So I think the new developers didn't want to mess up the series by doing something crazy and ambitious, so they instead resorted to basically doing nothing at all. and as a result, we got the horror game equivalent of cardboard. The only scary thing in this game is the price tag. This one gets a 5 out of 10. Xenosaga was created by Tetsuya Takahashi and his wife Soraya Saga, who both also served as the lead writers behind Xenogears. However, after Squaresoft, nowadays known as Square Enix, essentially canceled the Xenogears IP to instead focus on making the Final Fantasy movie The Spirits Within, Takahashi left Square to go and make his own company, Monolith Soft, where him and Soraya created the studio's first game, Xenosaga Episode 1. And let me tell you, Xenosaga Episode 1 is an absolutely miserable game. I have never hated my life more than when I was playing this game. Xenosaga Episode 1 has 40-minute long boss fights, 10-minute long generic enemy encounters, multiple 5-hour-long dungeons with no music, some of the worst combat mechanics I've ever experienced in not just the RPG genre, but video games as a whole. But I mean, come on, there's anime characters quoting the Bible. How could I not enjoy this? Yeah, okay, on many levels, Xenosaga Episode 1 is a bad game. This game has some of the worst battling I've ever experienced in a JRPG. There's a lot of enemies littered across the map, and that wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the fact that these enemy encounters take a minimum of 10 minutes each to complete. And if you run away from these battles, then you'll be underleveled for the boss fights and you'll have to go grind for more levels. I didn't skip any encounters throughout most of this game, and there were certain points where I decided to grind for levels, and still some boss fights would take at least 20 minutes to defeat. And in worst case scenarios, they would take upwards of 40 minutes to defeat. And nearly every boss in this game has some annoying gimmick that you need to work around to defeat it. And they also usually have a giant AoE attack that it can repeatedly spam to wipe out your entire party instantly. The combat itself has some pretty cool mechanics and ideas, but there's really no strategy beyond just spamming your strongest attacks repeatedly, at least during standard enemy encounters. This is especially the case for the mech battles, because they are about as deep as a glass of water. You basically just hit one button over and over until the enemy is dead. But I specifically want to call attention to the counter boosting mechanic. Single-handedly the worst gameplay mechanic I've ever experienced in an RPG. I sure do love it when the battles are actively rigged against the player and the game can decide to screw you over completely randomly for no reason at all. I would say that this game is the hardest Xeno game by quite a long shot, but not because it's actually challenging, but rather because it relies on being as cheaply unfair to the player as possible. Also, yeah, the pacing for this game is very odd. Sometimes you'll get 30 minutes of nothing but cutscenes straight, and then you'll immediately after be thrown into a 5-hour-long dungeon with absolutely no story content at all. Which I don't personally mind long cutscenes or even in some circumstances long dungeons, but I do still appreciate a good balance between the two. Also, there is nearly no music throughout this entire game. There is only one battle theme that plays throughout the entire game. One battle theme. Only one song that plays for every single enemy encounter and boss fight. And now that I've beaten the game, even just hearing the first 10 seconds of this song gives me PTSD. And as for the area music, it's completely non-existent. There are nearly no areas in this entire game with music. It's almost completely silent with the sounds of nothing but footsteps clanking in metal hallways the whole time, baby. Apparently, this is because the developers blew all their budget hiring an orchestra to perform music for the cutscenes, and then they just didn't have the budget or time to make any more music, which I find very funny. However, with all that being said, the music in this game is pretty solid, though some tracks are definitely a bit forgettable. The only thing that holds this game back from being last place on my list is the really solid story and cast of characters. Out of the 3 mainline Xenosaga games, this one definitely has the slowest paced story, but I think it works since it really focuses its time on world building and making you grow attached to the incredibly enjoyable characters. That's not to say that the story here is bad either, because it's certainly full of some incredible and memorable moments. Plus, this game does have a lot of charm to it. I think the art direction is very unique, the voice acting is pretty solid, and there's some cool mini-games and bits of side content to discover. While it was definitely a rough start to the Xenosaga trilogy, I came out of this game overall finding things to like about it, amongst all the blatant flaws that made this game hard to get through. So even though it could be pretty painful at times, I am definitely glad that I saw this one through to the end. I give this game a 5 out of 10. Skate 3 was an incredible game with some really fun movement, incredible area design, and plenty of fun challenges. Overall, it was an incredible skating game that nearly perfected the genre. But a decade went by with no information regarding a follow-up, until one day when Skate 4 was announced, and I waited in anticipation. Well, that was until EA announced it was gonna be a free-to-play game that reboots the entire series. The idea of a free-to-play skate game that was gonna take the series in a new direction filled with microtransactions didn't sound particularly exciting. Now, I know that I should have seen this coming because, well, it's EA and they're kind of known for doing this exact thing, but still, it was disappointing. That being said, the game finally launched in early access in 2025, simply titled Skate. But I don't care, I'm calling it Skate 4 anyways. Now, while I was initially skeptical of this game, I feel like my worries were simultaneously proven right and also wrong. The game is indeed full of microtransactions and has a much more clean and bland visual style, as opposed to the grittier and more raw aesthetic the previous Skate games had. And on top of that, the game also has this obnoxious and unbearable sanitized punk aesthetic. By that, I mean that the game is trying to come off as punk and rebellious, but it's also one of the most clean and corporate games out there, so it's just very contradictory and feels fake. The game feels like a company pandering, because that's exactly what it is. The characters in this game are genuinely horrendous, and the humor is laughable to say the least. Laughably bad, that is, because I seriously can't believe any real human wrote this dialogue.
Okay, whatever. Let's just get stunting. The Dax will dig the footy. That was nuts, and they ain't allergic.
Oh, hell no, man.
I actually would feel better if it turned out this game was written by AI, because at least that'd mean there's no human who actually wrote this dialogue and thought it was funny. By the way, slightly off topic, but can someone explain to me why so many games nowadays try to go for this fake rebellious aesthetic with annoyingly bad dialogue? I really have no idea what to call this aesthetic, or even how to properly describe it, but I'm just so tired of seeing it. I really don't believe anyone in the world actually likes this type of writing, except for company executives and investors, I guess. Now, what makes all that worse is that the game forces you to go through an hours-long tutorial full of nothing but unfunny attempts at witty dialogue. I was so close to uninstalling this game because of how insufferable the drawn-out tutorial was. I'm not even lying when I say that it took me about 2 hours to get through the first chunk of tutorials. Yeah, not even all the tutorials, just the first chunk of them. But thankfully, once you get out of the tutorial, the game actually becomes decently fun. Well, to be fair, the tutorial in this game is never truly over. I remember thinking that I was finally free to explore the world and have fun once I finished the tutorial. But nope. As you level up throughout the game, you are forced into doing more missions, which just serve as extra tutorials that you're forced to do. Seriously, even after 10 hours of playing the game, I was still unlocking new tutorials that you're required to complete. Also, another gripe that I have is the map feels a bit bland and lacking. The map is mostly pretty flat, and despite this being a skating game, there's not really any good skate parks or spots anywhere. But the map isn't horrible, it's just a bit boring. Overall though, aside from the horrible aesthetic choices, bad dialogue, tedious tutorials, and a fairly boring map, this game is overall pretty decent. While still not as smooth as it was in the previous Skate games, the skating movement is still pretty fluid and feels nice to control. I also did enjoy the various challenges scattered throughout the map. Some of them felt pretty difficult and also rewarding. The microtransactions in this game also weren't quite as bad as I expected they would be. There's nothing locked behind paywalls aside from cosmetics and a few props. But thankfully, it's pretty easy to get in-game money by just completing challenges and exploring. Now, that being said, we'll see how bad the microtransactions are in a few years, since games like this tend to get more greedy as they go. But aside from all that, by far the best thing about this game is the ridiculous physics engine and off-board movement. This game has so many movement options. You can dive, roll around in a ball, do flips, slide. There are just so many silly movement options. And I mean, the movement absolutely breaks the game, because, for example, it's actually faster to traverse the map by rolling around in a ball instead of skating. Now, while some may see this as an issue, I actually think this is what makes the game special. Without the wacky movement, Skate 4 really wouldn't have any identity of its own and would just be an immensely inferior version of Skate 3. And while I still don't think this game is anywhere as good as Skate 3, at least this movement gives it a unique gimmick you can't find anywhere else. It takes great advantage of the game's physics engine and is really fun to goof around with. Overall, Skate 4 is a pretty good free-to-play game that ended up being a little bit better than I expected, but it's also packed with writing and aesthetic choices that were probably done by 40-year-olds trying to be edgy and punk, while also trying to be as careful and inoffensive as possible. And as a result, the game suffers because of it in many different ways. Plus, there's also the awful tutorials, microtransactions, and a pretty lackluster map. Aside from all that though, the game is pretty solid at its core with some really fun movement and skating. It's just unfortunate that the good stuff is surrounded by a lot of bad stuff. This one gets a 5 out of 10. Well, it's good that Xenosaga Episode 1 ended up being my least favorite Xenosaga game, because that means it only gets better from here. Xenosaga Episode 2 proves to be a noteworthy step up in many ways from the first, but also deeply flawed in similar ways. To start with this game's immediate glaring issues, I mean, look at it. These character models are absurdly ugly, especially in comparison to how the characters looked in the first game. I mean, just look at how drastically different Cosmos looks between the two games. Apparently, Namco, the game's publisher, asked Monolith Soft to go for a more realistic approach with the character models. And yeah, that was an awful decision. I wouldn't even say that they did a good job at achieving their goal, because these models really don't look all that realistic, even for a PS2 game. Also, for whatever reason, many of the voice actors from the first game got recast in this one, and pretty much all the replacement voice actors are substantial downgrades, with some of them even being downright bad. In terms of the gameplay though, I find Xenosaga Episode 2 to be a major step up in many ways, and also equally as bad in other ways. The combat mechanics themselves are a lot more creative and engaging, and I think there's a lot more room for interesting battle strategy in this game. In fact, I would even say that the combat in this game is the best mechanically in the whole trilogy. It's incredibly satisfying to pull off combos with your entire party to deal major damage to the enemy. However, I will say that the mech battles are still just as boring and bland as they were in the first game. The boss fights in this game are also an improvement, because while they are still gimmicky and sometimes a bit obnoxious, the game is less obtuse about hiding their gimmicks. Overall, I had a lot of fun with Xenosaga Episode 2's battles. They were creative, engaging, well-paced, and fun. Well, that was until the game's second disc, in which everything went to hell. The first disc of this game is mostly story content with the occasional dungeon here and there. It overall felt pretty well paced. In fact, if anything, there weren't enough battles. But then comes the second disc, and the developers decided to add as much padding as humanly possible. The second disc is jam-packed with 5-hour-long dungeons full of back-to-back annoying puzzles, 10-minute long enemy encounters, 20-minute long annoying boss fights, and barely any story content until the final act. I was so close to loving this game, but they just couldn't help themselves but design the worst RPG ever made once again. Apparently this was done in response to the criticism towards the first Xenosaga game. People complained that the first game had too many cutscenes and not enough gameplay, and so I guess their solution to this problem was to add as much bloat to the game as they possibly could. But I also think that this was probably done to pad out the game's length, because this is by far the shortest game in the series, so they probably decided to fill this game with as many time-consuming dungeons and battles as possible just to make it longer. Also, this game definitely has much more side content compared to the first game, and while I would say that the side content in this game is okay, it's definitely nothing great either. There were a few pretty fun side quests, but also a few pretty downright horrible ones. All that being said though, there's still some incredible stuff in this game. As I said, the first disc is great with some really enjoyable and well-paced areas to explore, so I really have no complaints there. I also think the music in this game is really good. They finally added actual area themes and, most importantly, more than one battle theme, which is a major improvement from the first game. A lot of people really don't like the music in this game, mainly due to the inclusion of Shinji Hosoe, who composed all of the area themes. Around this point, Hosoe was mostly known for composing the soundtracks for arcade games, which a lot of people felt was out of place in a game like this. But I really don't get the hate at all because I think his music in this game fits the Frutiger Arrow and futuristic atmosphere of Xenosaga very well. And also a lot of the area themes in this game are bangers. And last but definitely not least, this game as a whole is full of some incredible story moments, with some moments in particular being up there with some of the best and most impactful writing in the entire series. Seriously, I cannot state enough just how much I love some of the story moments and writing in this game. This game has a much larger focus on Junior, and I will say that he is easily one of the most well-written characters in the entire Xeno franchise. But even aside from just him, the character writing in this game is truly fantastic. And in my opinion, this is where the Xenosaga story starts to really pick up. So overall, if this game had ended at Disc 1, I'd be happy and would rank it way higher. But unfortunately, Disc 2 is full of some horrible game design that truly prevents this game from being as good as it should have been. And so for that, I'm gonna give this game a 6 out of 10. Davey Redden is a game designer known for creating both the Stanley Parable and the Beginner's Guide, both of which are pretty cool games. Now, despite the fact that Redden hadn't released any new games in nearly 10 years, I was always curious to see what he'd make next. And finally, in 2024, he announced that his new development studio, Ivy Road, was developing their new game called Wanderstop. And, well, this certainly wasn't what I expected his next game to look like. I did not expect a cozy farming simulator game where you do nothing but make tea, but I guess that's what we got. Yeah, I'm gonna be perfectly honest. Right off the bat, I was not necessarily optimistic about this game just because of how it looked. I am not a fan of this cartoony Unreal Engine art style, and the story concept seemed a little bit too overbearing and in your face. But of course, as they say, never judge a book by its cover, so I still gave the game a shot since it was being made by a developer I respect. But yeah, this game is about what I expected. I'm not gonna say that this is a bad game, because it's not, but it's just really not a game for me. I still stand by my initial worries about this game. Though some of the art direction is nice and certain parts look good, I'm still overall just not a fan of this art style, especially when it comes to the character models. And yeah, the writing is very heavy-handed and sometimes can even come off a bit pretentious. This game beats you over the head with the same themes about burnout over and over again for basically its entire runtime, and never expands on those themes in an interesting or complex way to justify doing that. The actual story is good enough for what the game is trying to do, but the actual writing just comes off as very preachy sometimes. I did like most of the customers and found their characters to be quite endearing, even if the humor in this game didn't land all the time for me. And even though I did have some issues with the writing, I actually did find myself quite liking the main protagonist, Alta. From a gameplay standpoint, though, this game is pretty simple but charming. It has a very simple gameplay loop, but I never found it to be too repetitive. Wanderstop is trying to be the ultimate cozy game, in the sense that there are literally no stakes at all, and you can take the game as slow-paced as you want, which definitely makes this game very relaxing, and it works pretty well with the story concept. But one thing I am pretty mixed about, though, is the clearing changes, because while I do think that the clearing changes are a unique gameplay idea, it is pretty weird that a lot of your progress gets erased each time. I get why they're included in the game, since the clearing changes are supposed to represent living in the moment and moving on, but it ultimately just made it feel like I had no impact on the shop or any room for decision making, but yet again, maybe that's the point. Oh yeah, and also my game crashed a lot. I'm not sure why, but I assume it's something to do with Unreal Engine, which, I love Unreal Engine. Other than that, the farming mechanics are basic, but perfectly fine for what the game is. I enjoyed the tea brewing mechanics, and I think the pluffins are cool. So overall, while Wanderstop is a pretty good game, it just wasn't really my type of game personally. At the very least, I definitely enjoyed most of my time playing it, and it certainly serves its purpose as a relaxing, cozy game to shut your brain off and play. But did this game leave any lasting impact on me? Not really, but it was pretty fun while it lasted. This one gets a 6 out of 10. Pikmin is a series that I've dabbled in, but I've never fully gotten into it. A long time ago, I played a good chunk of Pikmin 3 and really loved it, but for some reason I just never beat it. I've also played the beginning of the first Pikmin a few times, but also never beat it. However, I finally decided to change that in 2025 by finally beating the first Pikmin game. I played the remaster on Switch, and overall, I really enjoyed it. That being said though, it's definitely not without its issues. The controls are by far my biggest issue with this game. They feel very awkward, especially when it comes to swapping around the different types of Pikmin. A lot of the time, the controls were the hardest part of this game and would sometimes lead to my Pikmin dying completely unnecessarily. Other than that though, this game is perfectly fine, but it definitely feels a bit like a tech demo and proof of concept more than anything. This game doesn't feel fully realized or fleshed out, but for what it is, it's a fun experience. I love the 30-day time limit, and I think it's such a creative concept that really adds a lot to the experience, even if it can be a little bit stressful. I really liked a lot of the puzzles and general gameplay mechanics. I thought that the area design was really nice. I thought that Olimar was a really good character, and the Pikmin themselves are pretty cool too. I really like how they go meow meow. They make some pretty cool sounds. And speaking of cool sounds, the music in this game is honestly one of its biggest highlights. Something about this game's soundtrack is just so good. It's very ethereal, otherworldly, and oddly nostalgic sounding. And then other times it'll hit you with the goofiest song you've ever heard in your entire life. Overall though, this is a short and sweet game, but definitely a bit underdeveloped. However, based on how much I enjoyed this game, I can only imagine that I'll like the sequels even more. I give this one a 7 out of 10. Ah, Xenosaga. What a goofy series you are. To get the full story of Xenosaga, you actually need to play a game released exclusively in Japan 2 decades ago for Vodafone devices. Yeah, that's right. There's an actually important spin-off game called Xenosaga Pied Piper and it's a Japan-exclusive mobile game from 2004. However, to make matters worse, Xenosaga Pied Piper eventually became lost media. As the years went by, there was no longer any method of playing this game for yourself. This made people resort to either reading the fan-translated script of the game online, or watching a really low-quality Let's Play of the game on YouTube to experience the story. But 2025 surprisingly ended up being an incredible year for all 20 Xenosaga fans in the world, because some dedicated Xeno fans had finally recovered Pied Piper 2 decades after it was originally released, allowing the game to finally be preserved and playable. But, it's very hard to emulate, and the game hasn't aged particularly well, and it's not very fun to play, and the translated version isn't complete yet, so it's still only in Japanese. So yeah, emulating the game yourself is still not really the optimal way to experience Pied Piper. But thankfully, also in 2025, Cyclone Fox, a dedicated Xenosaga fan who's been a part of the community for a long time, released a complete and faithful recreation of the game. This fan remake was built entirely from the ground up in RPG Maker, and it's easily the best way to experience the game. This finally gave people, including myself, a proper way to actually play Pied Piper after 2 decades of the game being unplayable outside of Japan. And let me say, this is an absolutely amazing remake, and it's possibly the coolest thing to ever come out of the Xeno series community. Not only is this a very accurate and faithful recreation of the game, but it also has many quality of life improvements. The combat is a lot less tedious to play, and it takes heavy inspiration from Xenosaga Episode 3's combat mechanics. Enemies are actually visible on the map now instead of being random encounters. Oh yeah, and I guess the most notable improvement is that the game is actually playable now, and it's also in English, so that's pretty good. The music was also completely redone by Wow Bob Wow, and it's a really good soundtrack with a few particularly standout songs. It's nice to have a completely remade soundtrack because, the music in the original game was not so great, to say the least. I mean, hey, this was a Vodafone game, so you gotta give them some credit for at least trying. And also, this remake includes some new artwork and character portraits drawn by Theorist, all of which look very good. Overall, though, this is a very great remake, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time playing it. In fact, it's even one of the best Xenosaga games. Pied Piper is a really fantastic addition to the Xenosaga story, and I strongly recommend any fan of the series to play it if they haven't already. The narrative takes a unique approach, with it essentially being a murder mystery noir story, and I truly was not expecting the writing to be as good as it was. Pied Piper has some incredible moments that are up there with the best in the series, and it expands upon the characters and world of Xenosaga very well. Playing this only made me grow a larger appreciation for the series. It's really nice to see that nearly 20 years since the release of the last Xenosaga game, there's still a passionate community for this niche series, and it led to this incredible remake being made. I give this one a 7 out of 10. Monster Hunter is a series I have very limited experience with. I played Monster Hunter World for about 15 hours or so before eventually dropping it for no particular reason. I really enjoyed it, and I always wanted to come back to it, but I just never did for some reason. But I decided to try the series again with the release of Monster Hunter Wilds, and I really liked it. The game definitely pulls a lot from Monster Hunter World, with it continuing the open world format. I found it really enjoyable to explore the world, and I really do like how diverse and different all the areas in this game are, even if I did think some areas were a bit too small and linear. Also, the Sacrets were an excellent addition to the exploration, allowing for much faster traversal. However, of course, the most important part of a Monster Hunter game is the combat, which is very fun and satisfying to play. I thought that the movement in this game felt much smoother compared to its predecessor Monster Hunter World, though of course I did have limited experience with that game. There is just something so satisfying about Monster Hunter combat and how heavy it feels. Pulling off big, hard-hitting combos just feels so incredibly fulfilling. I primarily found myself using the Switch Axe, which was a very fun weapon class to learn and use. The monsters were also amazing. I seriously loved every single monster in this game. Their designs are incredible, and learning their patterns and movements is very satisfying. Overall though, while the core of this game is very good, it is unfortunately held back by a few major things. This game's campaign is incredibly handholdy, and essentially forces you to progress the story on many different occasions before you can go out and explore the world at your own pace. I found myself trying to rush through the story as fast as possible just so I could finally be allowed to explore and do side content. The entire low-rank campaign just feels like one very long tutorial. Even though I didn't make it very far in Monster Hunter World, I never once found this to be an issue in that game throughout the entire 15 hours that I played of it. That being said, I do think the main story itself is pretty good. The missions themselves are pretty fun, and uncovering new regions of the map and finding new monsters throughout the story is a very memorable experience. The narrative itself is pretty mediocre. It's very slow-paced and pretty bland, but just as it starts to get a little bit interesting, the story just ends. So, that's it, I guess. Also, I'm sorry, but Nada is an annoying character, and I don't like him. I don't like how the entire story is basically just focused on him. Other than that, the game does have some noticeable performance and graphical issues, and there is a lack of high-quality post-game content. But thankfully, the game has been receiving lots of updates lately which have improved both of those issues. And presumably, this game will get a big DLC expansion down the line, similar to Iceborne for Monster Hunter World, which will fix even more issues. But once you get past all of its problems, Monster Hunter Wilds is a truly enjoyable experience. It's not perfect, but the gameplay is very addicting and satisfying, and the world is very beautiful. I had a lot of fun with my time playing this game, and I definitely look forward to playing it more as it receives more updates and probably a DLC expansion. I give this one a 7 out of 10. Mario Kart World was Nintendo's big launch title for the Switch 2, and as a pretty big fan of the Mario Kart series, did it live up to the hype? Well, yes and no. On one hand, this is arguably the best Mario Kart game, and on the other hand, it's definitely a bit lacking. To start off, this game has by far the best movement of any Mario Kart game. This game allows you to do charge jumps, rail grinds, wall rides, more tricks, and honestly, it's just so fun. This is by far the most advanced Mario Kart movement has ever been, and it's pretty crazy to see it being implemented in a way that's still beginner-friendly for just how complex it is. I'm also a big fan of the much wider variety of characters. I like being able to play as a Pianta, a penguin, a cow, a Monty Mole, and even more. It's really cool that they added so many unusual picks to the roster. I also absolutely have to praise this game for its music. I am not lying when I say that this game has one of the best soundtracks I've ever heard in a video game. There are over 350 songs in this game, and nearly all of them are insane. The soundtrack primarily has that jazz fusion sound that started in Mario Kart 8, but it's also the most varied soundtrack in Mario Kart history since it covers such a wide array of genres. I'm not lying when I say that there were multiple times in the game where I just paused to listen to the music. It's absolutely phenomenal. Other than that, the visuals are pretty great as well, and this is arguably the best looking Mario Kart game. I also love the addition of some of the new modes, especially the Knockout Tour, which is one of my favorite game modes in all of Mario Kart. It's such a cool concept and really fun in practice to be able to race from one end of the map all the way to the other with no breaks. But unfortunately, I can't confidently call Mario Kart World the best game in the series, and that's because of a few particular reasons. This game just lacks content compared to its predecessor, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe had way more tracks compared to Mario Kart World. And sure, that's because Mario Kart 8 Deluxe was already bundled with the DLC from the Wii U version. But Mario Kart World costs $80, which is $20 more than the base game of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. So for it to have even fewer tracks is kinda weird. And I also found the tracks in Mario Kart 8 to be way better and higher quality compared to the tracks in Mario Kart World. The tracks in World are still pretty good and have some creative ideas, but I definitely wouldn't say that they're the most interesting in the series either. Also, they're really dragged down by the intermissions, which take a lot of fun out of the Grand Prix. And the new open world mode feels pretty undercooked. I mean, the open world is fun, and I'm glad that it exists, but it's definitely not very interesting or rewarding. It kinda just feels like a gimmick rather than a fully fleshed out mode. I'd be more lenient on all of this if it weren't for the fact that this game took so long to release and also wasn't the most expensive game on the market right now. But we waited 8 years for this game, and it cost $80, so I don't think it was unreasonable to expect this to be the definitive Mario Kart experience, but it's just not really that as of right now. While it is a great game, it's just not really in a state where I'd recommend buying it right now. Instead, I suggest buying Mario Kart 8 Deluxe because it's cheaper and has way more content, and that's not even including its DLC. But I'm sure that Nintendo will eventually release DLC for Mario Kart World that will improve the game drastically. And maybe then I'll say that it's my favorite Mario Kart game. Though honestly, I'm not really a fan of releasing an $80 game and then also expecting people to buy DLC for it. But I also think that some of the hate that this game is getting is really overblown. No, this game is not a complete soulless cash grab. No, it's not the worst game in the series. And no, this game is not the physical incarnation of evil. It has lots of potential to be the best game in the series, but currently, it's not quite there yet in my opinion. However, what the game does currently offer is still an enjoyable experience that I had a lot of fun with. I give this one an 8 out of 10. Now, I feel like I should preface this by saying that I am not an expert when it comes to the Civilization games. I'm not very good at these games, and also I'm a very casual player. So please take it with a grain of salt when I say this very controversial statement. Civilization 7 is actually pretty good. Now look, my only experience with the Civilization series before this was Civilization 6, which is also a divisive entry. Despite having some pretty big issues with it, I overall liked Civilization 6, and I was really looking forward to the next game. Now, I was a bit disappointed when Civilization 7 launched to, not so positive reviews to say the least. The really negative reviews definitely did not get my hopes up for this game. But I still decided to give it a fair shot with an open mind. And man, I gotta be honest, I don't get the hate. Okay, well, that's not entirely true, because I do understand why the hardcore fans of this series dislike Civilization 7. But from a casual perspective, this is a very fun Civilization game. This game simultaneously fixes a lot of the issues that Civilization 6 had, but it also has some of its own unique issues. Possibly this game's biggest change from the previous entries, and also its most divisive change, is the age system. The game is now split into 3 different ages, and your civilization will undergo a fairly big reset per age. This was a very bold change for the developers to make, and I think there's both pros and cons to this mechanic. It ultimately makes the modern age by far the most important and relevant of the 3 ages, And also, perhaps you could say that it limits strategy by preventing players from absolutely dominating every other civilization. But on the other hand, I think it's cool since it helps keep the game constantly engaging and interesting, as your civilization is always drastically changing and evolving throughout the game. And while some people may not like it, I do like that it balances the game a bit more and makes it harder for one player to completely dominate everybody else. It levels the playing field pretty drastically and keeps things interesting. So yet again, as a casual player, I like this change. I think it's very unique and fun, but I do get that dedicated fans of the series may not like it. Also, every time you enter a new age, your civilization will also change into a completely different civilization, but your leader will stay the same. This is a weird change that I've also seen some people not like, but I don't get the hate for this one. I think it's a bit goofy, yeah, but it's fun and it adds strategy to the game since you have to find a civilization that matches well with your leader's playstyle. Also, I mean, come on, it's kind of fun being able to play as Benjamin Franklin ruling over ancient Greece. It's kind of silly and dumb, but I like it. But other than those two big changes, I think Civilization 7 is a much more streamlined version of Civilization 6. I personally think that the UI is massively improved, and a lot of the core gameplay mechanics have been simplified and made easier without really sacrificing versatility or strategy. Aside from the really big and controversial changes, I also like a lot of the new mechanics added into this game. There's also just plenty of nice quality of life improvements too. They basically fixed all of the issues that I had with Civilization 6, and I would argue that this is a much more cohesive and polished game. They did a great job at giving this game its own identity and gameplay style without deviating too far from the previous entries in the series. Visually, this game is also great looking, with far more detailed cities and landscapes. But most importantly, this game is just very satisfying and addicting to play. The Civilization gameplay loop is just very fun, and this game is as well. Ultimately, Civilization 7 is a great game that I might like even more than its predecessor. Though I definitely wouldn't say that it's an objectively better game, because it all kind of comes down to preference. I understand why this game is divisive, but I also think that a lot of the hate is people being close-minded because they got so accustomed to Civilization 6. I mean, there was nearly a decade-long gap between the two games. People have had almost 10 years to play Civilization 6 and get really used to all of its mechanics. So when a new game comes around and changes the formula, people aren't always gonna like it. But I don't know, man, I really thought that this game was gonna be worse than it was when I saw those initial reviews. That being said though, I am really glad that this game ended up being so different because I would rather them make something totally new rather than just make Civilization 6 again. So do I think that this game is overhated? Yes. But at the same time, I can't say I'm surprised because this game does make a lot of really bold and polarizing changes. All I know is that I had fun playing it, and that's what matters most, because my opinion is the correct one, no matter how many people will say it isn't. I give this one an 8 out of 10. I've never played an Assassin's Creed game before, so I finally decided to change that by playing Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. This was the game in the series that had always interested me the most because, pirates! And I definitely had a good time with this game. However, it's certainly far from perfect. To start off with my criticisms, the platforming movement feels incredibly dated. The platforming in this game is done by just holding down one button, and the game will automatically make you jump to the next platform. But during specific occasions, it will require you to push a button to jump to the next platform, which breaks the flow of the auto jump. Usually this only happens if the platform is far away, but sometimes it just randomly does this no matter the distance or height of the jump. And other times, the auto jump will lock onto the wrong platform, and this can result in getting caught during stealth missions since you jump to the wrong spot. Now, obviously, you can change the direction that you jump in, but it really just doesn't feel smooth to control. Now, most of the time, the platforming is fine and it works well enough, but when it doesn't work properly, it's pretty annoying. But easily my biggest issue with this game is some of the mission design. In particular, so many of the missions in this game are tailing missions, and let's be honest, does genuinely anybody have fun playing tailing missions? At best, these missions are boring, and at worst, these missions are boring and tedious. I would really rather do anything else in this game than the tailing missions. But unfortunately, they make up a lot of this game's main story missions. Now, that isn't to say that the main story missions are bad, because I actually like the vast majority of them, but the bad ones definitely stick out. But I will say that I do really love all of the stealth missions in this game. This game has some really fun stealth mechanics, and they're incredibly satisfying to play. So overall, the missions in this game are good, even if there's definitely a few bad ones. My last big criticism with this game is pretty much everything involving the modern day story. The modern day sections are pretty important to the overarching story, and throughout the whole game, it really feels like it's all building towards something big. But then by the end of the game, it just never really goes anywhere. I don't know, but by the end of the game, the whole modern day storyline just kinda felt pointless, despite how relevant it is. There's definitely some cool story concepts there, but the game just never really explores them fully. However, from my understanding, the modern-day story is relevant to the rest of the Assassin's Creed series, so maybe if I had played the other games, I would have enjoyed that part of the story more, but purely based off of this one game, it just seems really underdeveloped to me. Other than those pretty big criticisms, however, this is a very fun game. Visually, I think that this game has some really stunning looking areas, and I'm actually impressed at how well this game has aged graphically. I think that most of the characters in this game were pretty well written, even if some of the cast could feel a little bit underdeveloped at points, especially when it comes to the antagonists. But Edward in particular is a great character and makes for a very good protagonist with an interesting character arc throughout the game. And even though the story isn't anything particularly crazy, I definitely found it to be pretty interesting and captivating. And I do think that this game has a lot of different plot threads going on at once, and it manages to pull them all together pretty nicely by the end. But easily this game's strong suit is its gameplay loop. I absolutely loved pretty much all of the side content, and I found it to be very addicting to complete all of the assassin contracts and naval contracts. And also, the longer side quests in this game, such as the Templar hunts, were really fun as well and had some pretty endearing stories. I also love the open world exploration in this game. The ship is really nice to travel around in, and I like how this game is littered with stuff to do at literally every corner. I also found myself getting very addicted to filling out the collectible checklists in every different area. This game feels like a collectathon in many ways, and I was compelled to do basically everything I possibly could, and yet I never got burnt out. All of the different weapons and combat abilities were very enjoyable too. I particularly found myself absolutely obsessed with using the darts whenever I could. They were a really fun addition to the combat. I also really like the sense of progression when upgrading your ship. You start the game off by being very weak, but by the end, your ship can essentially destroy anything, and it's incredibly satisfying. Overall, Assassin's Creed 4 is a very flawed game with sometimes poor mission design, movement that hasn't aged all that well, and sometimes underdeveloped writing. But I think it has a very enjoyable and engaging gameplay loop, and I found myself enjoying most of the experience even with the occasional annoying moments here and there. I got very addicted to this game for a while, and overall found myself enjoying its story, world, characters, stealth gameplay, and combat mechanics. Despite this game's glaring issues, I think its positives shine through the negatives, and it's a pretty enjoyable pirate adventure. Army matey, I got scurvy. I give this one an 8 out of 10. After the commercial and critical failure of Xenosaga Episode 2, Monolith Soft was told by Bandai Namco that they were only going to greenlight one more Xenosaga game. Bandai Namco was going to put the final nail in the coffin of the Xenosaga series, and Monolith Soft was given one final chance to make a truly great Xenosaga game. And well, they did it. I have never seen a video game studio lock in harder than Monolith Soft did for Xenosaga Episode 3. They knew that this was their final opportunity to conclude the series, and they took it seriously, because Xenosaga Episode 3 is a genuinely amazing game, which is pretty surprising considering that it only released 2 years after Episode 2. First and foremost, this game fixes almost every single issue that I had with the first 2 games. The combat is really snappy and quick and isn't full of annoying gimmicks and mechanics anymore. Even the mech combat has been vastly improved in this game. And also, the dungeons are actually fun and aren't complete slogs to get through. This is also by far the best looking Xenosaga game, and I think that it perfectly blends together the art styles of the previous 2 games. Even the environments look way better in this game. This game looks very good graphically for a PS2 game. Also, many of the voice actors from Xenosaga Episode 1 return to reprise their roles in this game, and they all sound incredible. The soundtrack in this game is easily the best in the trilogy, with some tracks in particular being really beautiful. As per usual, the cast of Xenosaga is excellent and well written, but their writing is especially amazing here in Episode 3. This game single-handedly makes Shion one of the best and most realistically written protagonists I've ever seen in a video game. And while sadly not all of the characters get equal amounts of screen time or development in this game, I still overall found myself loving what they did for the cast. And Xenosaga Episode 3 tells an absolutely fantastic story. This game easily has the most absolutely bold and deranged writing in the entire Xeno series, and I mean that in the most positive way possible. This game's writing really does not hold back at all, especially not when it comes down to the religious content that the Xeno series is known for. Now, unfortunately, this game is still not perfect. A big issue that I had with this game is the combat being a bit too simple and easy. It's a complete contrast compared to the issue that I had with the other 2 games, whereas I thought that those games were too difficult and unfair. But Xenosaga Episode 3 just kinda goes too far in the opposite direction, and it ends up being too easy. This is the only Xeno game where I never once lost a single battle. And I never really had to think very deeply about my combat strategy. The combat is pretty fun mechanically, but it's just very simple. Honestly though, after how brutal it was to get through the other 2 games, it kinda felt nice just to breeze through this one. My other big issue with this game is its pacing. I don't think that the pacing is bad by any means, but the middle portion of this game is noticeably slower and less interesting compared to the incredibly strong start and end. Certain sections of this game also drag on and can definitely be a bit repetitive. But other than those 2 big issues, this really is just an excellent game that sends off the Xenosaga series in the best way possible. Given the circumstances that this game was developed in, I truly can't think of a better way to conclude the series and its story. Monolith Soft really gave their all with this game, and it shows. While it may be a bit sad that the Xenosaga series never continued and was never completed in the way that it was originally intended, ultimately, if it weren't for the failure of the series, we would have never gotten Xenoblade, and Monolith Soft wouldn't be as successful as they are now. Despite Square Enix and Bandai Namco doing all they could to stop it, the Xeno series is still around, and its future is brighter than ever. And if it weren't for Xenoblade, I probably would have never found myself playing Xenogears or Xenosaga. So honestly, I think Xenosaga's failure may have been a blessing in disguise. I give this one an 8 out of 10. In 2025, there was one game that dominated every single award show. One game that some people claimed would redefine the very genre that it was a part of. One game that made everyone cry from its heart-wrenching storytelling. One game that many people said would completely change the video game industry as a whole. I'm of course talking about Tamagotchi Plaza. Honestly, I'm afraid that video games will never be the same again after this. How could any game ever live up to the impossibly high standards this sets? From the advanced dental hygiene mechanics to the absolutely stunning next level visuals in the overworld. This is a revolutionary game that will... okay, this is a dumb bit and it's gone on for too long, so let's talk about Expedition 33. Clair Obscur Expedition 33 won Game of the Year, and it's the most universally acclaimed game of the entire 2020s decade so far. But I'm actually a very obnoxious and pretentious person, and I think that I'm smarter than everybody else, so I'm gonna say that this game is overrated. Okay, well, yes, I do think that this game is being a bit overrated, but it's kinda hard for anything to live up to the hype when it's being called the savior of the RPG genre as a whole. And let's be honest, this game is not particularly groundbreaking by any means. The only people who are saying that it is are probably people who don't play that many RPGs anyways. But still, I am really glad to see that this game has become as popular and as acclaimed as it is, because I love JRPGs, and to see a game that is very clearly inspired by them become this popular and mainstream is very cool. So yes, I do think that this game is being a bit overhyped, but if there's any game I wanted to see become this successful, it's this one. And obviously I don't dislike this game, otherwise it wouldn't rank so high on my list. And out of the few games that I played that actually released in 2025, this is my favorite. So I guess you could say it's my game of the year for 2025. Expedition 33 is just such a finely crafted and well put together experience. The art direction and environments are absolutely stunning. And while I do have some issues with the art style, mainly because I'm not a big fan of the Unreal Engine 5 graphics, I can still say that this game's art direction is very beautiful, and I really love just how much attention to detail there is. But by far this game's biggest highlight for me is its combat, which is very well put together. The combat mechanically is very enjoyable. The parrying and dodge mechanic really adds so much intensity and spice to the game, while still being very addicting and satisfying. It's very cool that parrying and dodging also introduces many different playstyles to an otherwise pretty standard combat system. And learning all the enemy attack patterns is really rewarding. I also loved how every single character in the party has their own unique fighting style. And the game's customization with Pictos and Lumina is also surprisingly complex for being so simple. I really have no major complaints with this game's combat system, and honestly, it's some of the most fun that I've ever had with turn-based combat. I did unfortunately find some of the side content to be a bit lacking, because while there are a few really cool side areas to explore that lead to good rewards, there's also a lot of side content that isn't really all that memorable or fully fleshed out, though it definitely wasn't bad by any means. But another amazing aspect of this game is its music. This game has incredible music, especially for being composed by some random guy the developers found on SoundCloud. The highlights of this soundtrack are absolutely spellbinding. I really love all of the ethereal and beautiful ambient area themes, and they also certainly went all out with the high-energy battle themes. The story of this game is also pretty good. Conceptually, the narrative is really great and has a very interesting hook, and I also really appreciated the high-quality world building throughout the game. The characters are also very nicely written and believable, though unfortunately, a lot of the cast doesn't really get time to shine during the main story itself. And another major gripe that I have with this story is that I find the pacing falls off really hard around the midpoint. Around that point, the story definitely starts to feel a bit rushed and the progression feels a bit abridged. But I will say that this game definitely pulls it all together by the end for an absolutely phenomenal conclusion. And while the overall story may not have been mind-blowing in my opinion, I can safely say that certain parts definitely left a big impression on me. So while Expedition 33 may not be the greatest game ever made, I'm definitely glad to see it become popular and beloved. It's a very solid game with some excellent combat, a very enjoyable story, and some very stunning art design and music. I also think it's very cool to see a JRPG-inspired game made by ex-Ubisoft employees become the most acclaimed game of the decade. And I can hope that maybe, just maybe, this game will spread a good message to the rest of the gaming industry. I give this one an 8 out of 10. You thought I was done talking about the Xeno series? Not a chance. Xenoblade Chronicles X is a game that I was honestly never all that interested in, despite being a huge Xenoblade fan. This is mainly because I'd always heard people say that the story wasn't a big focus, which made me a bit skeptical because I've always considered the story to be arguably the biggest appeal to the Xenoblade series. But regardless, being such a big fan of the series, I finally decided to give the game a shot with the definitive edition on Switch that released in 2025. And yeah, honestly, I'm not really sure why I was too worried because I loved it. It's definitely true that this is the most unique Xenoblade game, with it strongly focusing on open world exploration and side questing more than any other game in the series, but it does an excellent job at both of those things. I got very addicted to the gameplay loop, and I actually found myself getting 100% completion, which is something I've never done in any other Xenoblade game. The open world is incredible. Mira is easily one of the most beautiful video game worlds ever created, with every single region standing out in its own way. They really did an excellent job at capturing the atmosphere of exploring a mysterious alien world. And traversing the map is incredibly fun with the inclusion of skells, which are essentially large customizable mechs that can drive and fly across the world. Seriously, I cannot state enough just how cool the skells are. They are possibly the most fun and cool form of transportation I've ever seen in a video game. There is just something so exhilarating about flying around in these things. Unfortunately though, one of my biggest gripes with this game is some of its graphical issues. This game has a genuinely sickening amount of motion blur, and there is no way to disable it. I have no idea who thought that this looked good, but thankfully, after the many hours I spent on this game, I did eventually get used to it, even though it definitely took a while. Also, another gripe that I have with this game is the frame rate being really bad at some points. But I will let this one slide because this is a Switch 1 game originally made for the Wii U, so it's not like Monolith Soft had much to work with in terms of graphical power. Considering just how much there is going on in this game, it's honestly pretty impressive that they managed to get this game running on a Nintendo Switch. So of course I'm not going to expect it to be completely perfect. Hello everybody, I'm updating this part of the video because literally the day after I recorded this section, Nintendo released a Switch 2 upgrade pack for Xenoblade X. And the new upgrade pack allows the game to run at 4K 60 FPS, so this completely fixes all of the issues that I had with the game's frame rate. And also I noticed that the upgrade pack seemingly gets rid of a lot of the motion blur too. I'm not an expert, so I can't say for sure, but I always assumed that the motion blur was a graphical decision, but the fact that they removed it makes me wonder if it was a technical limitation on the Switch 1 or something like that. But regardless, I'm glad that it got fixed. However, unfortunately, the Switch 2 upgrade pack does come with its own problems. They added some sort of smoothing or anti-aliasing to the game that just makes everything look horrible. It's especially really noticeable on textures in the distance. However, I will say it's not super noticeable when playing the game in docked mode, but it's very noticeable in handheld mode. In fact, the upgrade pack makes handheld mode look worse than it did originally. However, in my opinion, the upgrade pack definitely improves the game in docked mode. So for me personally, this upgrade pack is definitely an improvement because I don't really play games in handheld mode that much. But it is still unfortunate nonetheless that this isn't necessarily a perfect upgrade pack. But I am very glad that this at least fixes the motion blur and the frame drops. Anyways, back to the rest of the video. However, possibly my biggest complaint with this game is its combat. This is by far the worst combat system of any of the Xenoblade games. Mainly because it's way too easy. The moment you unlock the overdrive mechanic pretty early on in the game, it's over instantly, because you've just unlocked the win every single fight immediately button. And while I do think that the overdrive mechanic is a cool idea, and there's definitely some fun to be had when it comes to killing enemies 20 levels higher than you, it also leads to the game never posing any challenge because you basically just spam overdrive and your strongest arts repeatedly to win every single battle. And Skell battles are just even more of a joke. Also, for some reason, they decided to add a quick cooldown to the Definitive Edition, which just allows you to spam your arts repeatedly, and this just makes the game even more broken. Now look, I have nothing against becoming overpowered in a Xenoblade game, because that's honestly one of the biggest appeals of their combat systems in my opinion. But in Xenoblade X, it just feels way too easy to become overpowered very early on in the game. I'm not the type of player to go for very optimal builds in these games. I like to experiment a lot with a bunch of different build ideas, and I never really focus on optimizing my party too heavily. So even though I wasn't trying to make my character as broken as possible, I still ended up doing exactly that without even trying. However, I do think that the amount of customization is pretty cool, and you can go very in-depth with this game if you want. And I'm always a very big fan of weapon class switching in Xenoblade games, so I very much so enjoyed its inclusion here. Also, considering this is a Xenoblade game, of course it has an excellent soundtrack. Though, the soundtrack in this game is very different, since it's the only Xenoblade soundtrack composed by Hiroyuki Sawano, known for composing the soundtracks for a lot of anime, most notably Attack on Titan. As a result of this, Xenoblade X's soundtrack is vastly different from the music in the other games, but it works well with the very alien and futuristic aesthetic that this game has. And yes, there are a lot of divisive songs in this soundtrack, but honestly, they grew on me a lot as I played the game. I remember listening to the songs Black Tar and the New Los Angeles Nighttime theme before actually playing the game myself, and I remember not really liking them at all. But honestly, once I played the game myself, they grew on me a lot. They fit the context of the game very well. All that being said though, people were definitely not lying when they said that the story wasn't a big focus in this game. Because yep, this is easily one of the most mediocre video game stories I've ever experienced. The story has a pretty interesting concept, albeit it is a little bit basic. Pretty much every single chapter in this game comes down to the same thing. Oh no, there are aliens doing something bad, we have to go stop them. However, that being said, the story actually does start to get pretty interesting right at the very end. It's just unfortunate that everything leading up to that point is very boring. However, the side quests are definitely where most of the writing focus went, and there are some very fun side quests in this game with cool storylines. I also liked all the different recruitable party members and how each of them got their own arcs throughout the side quests. Also, the definitive edition of the game added an entirely new epilogue chapter to the main story. The new epilogue chapter is genuinely amazing and is so much better than I could have possibly imagined it would be. Honestly, it's so good to the point that it redeems the entire narrative for me. Overall, Xenoblade Chronicles X is a very fun open-world game with a beautiful world, fun exploration mechanics, a great soundtrack, and some excellent side content. And also, it's pretty easy to see why this game became so influential to open-world games as a whole, because I do think that this game was ahead of its time in many ways. But unfortunately, it suffers from a very bland main story, some pretty bad graphical issues, and a very deeply flawed combat system. It's definitely a very fun game though, and I never got bored of it despite it being the game I spent the most time on in 2025. I give this one an 8 out of 10. And here's where any credibility I had goes out the window. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is, certainly one of the video games of all time. Look, this game is very divisive, and for good reason. This game is very flawed, and I could probably talk for hours about all the problems I have with it. I pretty much agree with every single bit of criticism people have towards this game. Yes, the story is not well written at all. Yes, all of the puzzles are way too easily breakable. Yes, the Sky Islands and the depths are completely wasted potential. Yes, the dungeons aren't very good. Yes, this game was disappointing in so many ways. So, if I believe all of that to be true, then why does this game rank second place on my list? Well, it's kind of, okay, look, I'm biased towards the Zelda series, and Breath of the Wild was already one of my favorite games of all time, so Tears of the Kingdom expanding on it is plenty enough for me. Also, just to quickly address something, yes, it took me 2 years to beat this game. I played the game on launch day, and I grinded it for a long time, but very close to the end of the game, I just dropped it for no reason at all. And honestly, I don't even know why. I never got bored of the game, and I never lost interest in it, but for some reason I just didn't bring myself to actually finish it until very early in 2025. And interestingly enough, I did this exact same thing with Breath of the Wild as well. I started Breath of the Wild in 2017, and I got right to the end of the game, but then I randomly decided to drop it, and I didn't beat it until early in 2019. I guess it's just something about these open-world Zelda games that do this to me. I'm not sure why, but it is what it is. Anyways, with that aside, let's actually review the game. My biggest issues with this game are the Sky Islands and the depths. They are basically completely empty, aside from a few small locations. The sky especially was disappointing, since it was one of the things I looked forward to the most in this game. I always loved the concept of the Sky Islands ever since they were introduced in Skyward Sword, but unfortunately, I found them to be very underdeveloped in that game, and so I was hoping that Tears of the Kingdom would kind of do the concept justice this time around. But nope, unfortunately, they're still just as underdeveloped in this game as they were in Skyward Sword. There were a couple cool islands, but most of them were identical and had nothing to do on them. And the depths somehow managed to be even more uninteresting than the Sky Islands. The depths look cool visually, and there's some pretty fun gimmicks, but exploring the depths is just very repetitive. Once you've explored a tiny bit of it, you've seen it all. Out of all the new additions to the map, I actually found myself enjoying the caves and wells the most. They were actually pretty fun to explore and had quite a bit of variety to them. The dungeons were also a bit lackluster, because while they certainly are an improvement over the ones in Breath of the Wild, since the ones in this game at least have actual unique themes, I still found them to be too easy and short and nowhere near the level of quality the dungeons in the older Zelda games were. However, I did find the shrines to be a lot more fun and well designed in this game. Most of them had very creative and interesting concepts that kept me engaged. However, another major issue with this game is how easy it is to cheese most of the puzzles. This game gives the player complete freedom to solve a puzzle however they want, and that's a bit of a double-edged sword. Because while it is fun to have so much freedom, it also results in pretty much every puzzle being solvable by just using Recall, Ascend, or certain Ultra Hand builds. The game gives you so many options and tools to experiment with, but it never really incentivizes the player to actually try anything beyond the bare minimum, because in most cases, doing the bare minimum is more efficient than coming up with elaborate solutions to puzzles. That being said though, this truly is the ultimate sandbox Zelda game. While they can be used to break the game, Ultra Hand and Fuse are especially fun gimmicks and are some of the most technically impressive mechanics I've ever seen in a video game. They're incredibly seamless and easy to use, but can allow for some really complex creations. On top of that, Ascend is one of the best quality of life features in a video game ever. Allowing the player to no-clip through ceilings is really fun and opens up a lot of room for unique puzzles. The Recall ability is also a technical marvel, and I genuinely have no idea how they got this mechanic to work without exploding my Switch. Overall, this game has some of the most impressive tools and mechanics in any video game ever. And the amount of options and creativity these tools open up is truly incredible. I've heard people say that Tears of the Kingdom kind of feels like Breath of the Wild, but if you were playing in creative mode instead of survival, and I think that's a very accurate way to describe the gameplay loop. I will say that I'm a bit mixed towards this game's story, because on one hand, this is one of the best stories in the series conceptually. This game has many impactful story moments that are up there with some of the best in all of Zelda. But then sometimes, no matter how hard I want to try and glaze this game, there's just some storytelling decisions that I really cannot defend. The dragon's tears were an incredibly bad pacing decision, since you can view them out of order, and it can lead to you quite literally spoiling yourself on the story. The memories in Breath of the Wild at least made sense in the game's context, since Link's memories were supposed to be scattered and out of order. But there was literally no reason at all to do that same format here, since it just objectively makes the story experience worse. Also, Secret Stone, Demon King, they repeat the same dialogue over and over a lot of times. I really don't know what they were thinking with that, man. And there's an absurd amount of plot inconsistencies, which come purely as a consequence of this game being so open-ended and non-linear. But you see, here's the catch. I'm a biased Zelda fan, and this game is full of hype moments and aura, as the kids would say. So ultimately, I'm able to look past its flaws and still enjoy the story for what it is. But I can admit, I would be lying if I said that the writing in this game was good. However, I did really love this game's atmosphere. All the different regional phenomena stories were very enjoyable, and I loved seeing how all the different civilizations had evolved and grown in the few years since Breath of the Wild. They did an amazing job at making it feel like Hyrule was truly recovering after the events of Breath of the Wild. Despite being set in the same world, Tears of the Kingdom feels so tonally different, with it being much more positive and prosperous compared to the very dreary and post-apocalyptic setting of Breath of the Wild. I also found that this game has some of the best side quests in the entire Zelda series. A few in particular had some really excellent storylines. Also, the music in this game is absolutely phenomenal, with it having one of the best soundtracks in the whole series. I feel like the music strikes a great balance between the quieter, ambient themes and the loud and melodic tracks that Zelda is known for. Visually, this game is really beautiful. Even though it has the same art style as Breath of the Wild, I feel like the actual art direction was really improved here. The Sky Islands in particular really stood out to me as being very visually nice. I really loved how lush and serene they looked. Overall, Tears of the Kingdom is nowhere near a perfect game. In fact, I would argue that this is one of the most objectively flawed Zelda games. Even Breath of the Wild is a substantially better game in terms of its quality. There are a lot of things that I wish this game did differently. I think it had the potential to be one of the best Zelda games, but I can't lie, they fumbled it pretty hard. However, despite how flawed this game is, this is my list, so I get to decide where I rank it. And if I'm being totally honest here, this is one of the most fun games I've ever played. I constantly found myself engaged in all the new discoveries, and all of the new mechanics were fantastic forward-thinking additions that I had a lot of fun experimenting with. So while I do understand why this game is as heavily criticized as it is, and I agree with majority of the criticism, I still believe that this game is very memorable and fantastic, and I loved almost every single hour that I spent on this game. I give this one a 9 out of 10. I played Earthbound all the way back in 2016, and it was one of the first RPGs I ever played. It quickly became one of my favorite games of all time, and as the years went on, I replayed it many times, and it's only grown on me even more. Now, despite my love for Earthbound, I had actually never played its follow-up, Mother 3. I always wanted to, but I just kept putting it off over and over again. Partially because I tend not to emulate games unless absolutely necessary, and notoriously, Mother 3 was never released outside of Japan, so the only way for me to play it was through emulating the fan translation. I know, that's kind of a dumb reason to avoid playing the game for 9 years, but that's the reason why. However, last year, I finally decided to just go for it. And yep, it was worth it in every single way. There is not a single dull moment in this entire game. Every single time I booted up this game, I always found myself instantly hooked by the incredible dialogue, eccentric world, and how there was always something completely new and unexpected at every corner. The combat is pretty simple, but I found it to be engaging enough for the runtime of the game, and there were a lot of memorable battles. I think the combat system's simplicity honestly works in its favor, and I had a lot of fun with it. I really like the addition of the musical combos, which were very satisfying and addicting to pull off. The soundtrack is absolutely fantastic as well. How they got this game to sound so good on a Game Boy Advance sound chip is actual wizardry as far as I'm concerned. I love the way the music utilizes and manipulates many different motifs for thematic purposes. And it also results in this game having one of the catchiest video game soundtracks I've ever heard. Seriously, I had so many tracks from this game stuck in my head for months after I beat it. And visually, this game looks really good. I love how much charm there is in the UI elements, and how much more fleshed out all the sprite work and animations are in comparison to Earthbound. The art style is very delightful, and this game is just very timeless graphically. However, something about this game that caught me completely off guard was its story. Look, I've been in online Nintendo circles for many years now. So of course I've always heard people talk about how Mother 3 is the saddest game Nintendo's ever made. And unfortunately, I was also spoiled on many different parts of this game's story, which was also part of the reason why I never had much interest in playing this game over the years. And yet, despite having all of those expectations going into this game, the story still caught me off guard on so many different occasions. Even though this game's story was written all the way back in the mid-90s, it's aged incredibly well, and its themes continue to be relevant all these years later. And yeah, people were definitely not lying when they said that this is the saddest Nintendo game, because damn, this is easily one of the most depressing games I've ever played. But I don't consider it to be a hopeless or bleak story either. It's a very bittersweet and beautiful story as well. This game's narrative isn't the most insane or mind-blowing thing ever, but it's just very effective at what it does. And it drives its themes home in a very genuine, heartfelt, and powerful way. And of course, as expected from a Mother game, the dialogue is very funny and witty. A lot of this game's humor and jokes are very memorable and really help make the world of Mother 3 feel very lively. Overall, Mother 3 is just one of those rare games where I really have no problems with it at all. Sure, there are minor things that I could nitpick, but in terms of major issues, there really aren't any. And this game left such an impact on me to the point that none of those nitpicks matter at all to my overall enjoyment. Also, I'm sure at this point most people are aware of the development hell that this game went through, with it originally beginning development as Earthbound 64 back in 1994, but this version of the game was delayed and ultimately cancelled. And even though it would have been very fascinating to see what the game would have been like had Earthbound 64 actually been completed, it's honestly really surprising that this game even got released at all, even if it was in the form of a much smaller scale GBA game. I'm just very glad that this game exists at all. And also, while I would love to see this game get officially released outside of Japan, chances are it'll never happen. So if you're at all like I was and are skeptical about emulating this game, my advice to you is just do it already. It's very easy to emulate, the fan translation is excellent and professional level quality, and this game really is just something worth experiencing. Mother 3 is one of the most perfect games ever made, and it's instantly become one of my favorite games of all time. I give this one a 10 out of 10. And with that, we're done. That took a while. Do you agree with my ranking? Was there anything that you disagreed with? Feel free to tell me about it in the comments. But make sure that your comment is as mean as possible. Honestly, this video was a lot more effort than I expected. I started making this video in early January, and now it's March. I thought this video was going to be a lot shorter, but I guess I just can't stop myself from yapping. Though honestly, I've been pretty lazy when it comes to actually making this video, so that's probably why it took so long. Regardless though, I just wanted to make this video as a bit of a writing exercise. It's almost been exactly 3 years since my last game review video, so I wanted to see if I still had it in me. I've been considering maybe making more videos again. I do have a plan for a bigger video that might come out sometime later this year, who knows? Or maybe I won't upload again for another 3 years, who knows? It'll probably be the latter option. Anyways, feel free to subscribe to the channel so that way you can be notified when I upload again in 3 years. Though, even if I don't upload proper videos anymore, maybe I'll make this type of video a yearly tradition. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to go and drink some water. Goodbye.